Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing, number 137. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. Swamp Thing and Abby Arcane have officially broken up. And even though it's pretty recent, both have found love in new places. Abby is going out with a man named Don, who's a friend of John Constantine's. And Swamp Thing is communing, we'll call it, with Lady Jane in the green because she is an elemental. And in the background, the evil Anton Arcane has risen again in the body of General Sunderland. And he has actually just kidnapped Abby after she was on a date with Dawn. So Dawn has gone to the swamps with John Constantine. He was able to pull Swamp Thing away from his lovemaking with Lady Jane and told him that Abby is missing. So they are on their way to save Abby from the Sunderland headquarters in Washington, D.C. And we left off last time with Abby being tied up in a chair inside of the science lab of the Sunderland Corporation and her realizing that General Sunderland was in fact her evil uncle Anton Arcane come back from the dead. Oh, and there was also a weird thing with Tefe. She has a new appearance. She looks a lot more like Swamp Thing now with her face. And that is because she went on her own little adventure to a place called Free Country where she used a bunch of power and that ended up changing the way she looked. So first things first, with issue 137, we got the cover here and we see there is a man sitting at a desk and he's talking to someone, but his eyes are blank. So it looks like maybe he's being puppeted or something, like he's a body. Then behind him, we see a giant grotesque monster version of Anton Arcane with his hand on the shoulder of this puppet body. And there's a bunch of flies coming out of his mouth and stuff. And then around the sides and in front of the desk, we see a bunch of different types of monsters that are waiting to attack. And we also see that this issue is written by Nancy Collins with art by Russell Braun and Kim DeMolder. And we start off on the first page with a more in-depth telling of what happened on the last page of the last issue, where Abby is tied up to a chair in the middle of a laboratory in the Sunderland Corporation. And she's passed out, but someone is trying to wake her up by saying, Abby, time to wake up. And we see Abby beginning to come to. And then we also see that General Sunderland is the one who's talking to her, and she's not waking up fast enough for him. So he grabs her by the hair and pulls her head back and says, I said, time to wake up, bitch. And this does wake her up, of course. And he looks at her and he says, Sleeping Beauty awakes at last. So now that Abby's awake, she looks at the man in front of her and she says, What's going on here? Who the hell are you? And Sunderland says, Surely you must have guessed my identity by now. And then she focuses on him and she says, General Sunderland? But that's impossible. You died. And Sunderland replies, You hurt my feelings, sweetie. Is it so unusual for one such as myself to wish to spend time with members of the family? And then she realizes what he's saying and she says, Oh no. And then we get a creepy 3/4 panel of General Sunderland leaning into her and saying, Oh yes, dear Abigail. Oh yes. And we see half of his face is of the human General Sunderland, but the other half is the evil demon version of Anton Arcane. And we see the name of this issue is Dead Relatives. So just as Sunderland makes his big revelation to Abby, they are interrupted as Constance Sunderland walks into the room and says, Daddy, who is this woman? And Sunderland, looking surprised, turns to her and says, Constance, how good of you to stop by, unannounced. This is the Swamp Thing's woman, the one I told you about. Polygon abducted her per my orders. And Abby tries to scream out to let Constance know that this is not General Sunderland anymore, that this is in fact Anton Arcane. But before she can get any words out other than he's not, General Sunderland shoves a rag in her mouth. And Constance, who's kind of evil as well, doesn't acknowledge Abby or what's going on, other than that she's mad that there's another woman in the room with him. So she continues, Yes, but why is she here? And then General Sunderland walks over to Connie and puts his hand under her chin, and he says, Why, she's integral to my plan, dear heart. once he learns his mate has been kidnapped, the Swamp Thing, will quite literally move mountains to rescue her. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about." But still not satisfied, Connie says to him, "Why not dispose of her then? What difference does it make if we bait the trap with live meat?" And at this, Sunderland gets very mad and he yells, "It matters to me! It's my plan, my vengeance. Now either get out and let me handle things my way, or pay the price of interfering. Is that understood?" And Connie is taken aback by this, and she just replies, "Yes, Daddy." And then she walks out of the room all sad, and as she leaves, General Sunderland walks over to Abby and kind of caresses her face. Then the door closes, and we begin to follow Connie as she cries down the hallway. And then she hears something behind her, and she turns around, and she's frightened for a second by a man in a cloak. And we've seen this cloak before. It is actually the cloak of Dr. Polygon with his new body. So I guess to not frighten her, although this would be pretty frightening, Dr. Polygon removes his cloak, I guess to show her that it's him. And he says, "Miss Sunderland." And he's kind of smiling at her. And she says, "Polygon?" And he replies, "Don't be sad, Miss Sunderland. I'm still your friend." To which she immediately just turns around and says, "Terrific. That's all I need. Tea and sympathy from a freak." And then Polygon sighs as she walks away. Then we cut to somewhere in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, and we are back with Swamp Thing, Lady Jane, Tefe, Swamp Thing, and Dawn. And we're getting the exact moment where everybody sees Tefe's new face for the first time. And we hear John exclaim, "Struth," which is a slang British term for surprised. And we see Tefe holding a picture up to Swamp Thing and saying, "Drew you picture, Daddy, see?" And in the background, we see Dawn whispering to John, "That's Abby's baby?" I guess because she resembles Swamp Thing more than she does Abby now. So as Lady Jane passes Tefe to Swamp Thing asks her, "Lady, why does she look like this? What has happened?" And Lady Jane answers, "I am not sure, Prime Founder. It appears that Tefe's elemental heritage has come suddenly to the fore." And as Swamp Thing looks at her closely, he says, "She isn't ill. Outside of this drastic change in appearance, she seems normal." And Lady Jane says, "Perhaps she underwent some form of severe trauma while we were away." And Tefe's not liking Swamp Thing not paying attention to her still. He's talking to Lady Jane over her. So she points to her picture again and says, "See, Daddy, see." And finally, Swamp Thing looks at her and says, "Yes, Tefe, I see the picture. It's very nice." And if you remember, the picture is of like a Raggedy Ann doll and a couple different animals. And those are actually things that she saw while she was away in this weird Never Never Land called Free Country. So it's kind of messed up that he's blowing her off and not even looking at the picture, because he might actually be able to figure out what happened to her if he did. Then suddenly Dawn runs up in between Lady Jane and Swamp Thing, and he says, "Hey, forget about the kid. What about Abby? Remember her?" And just as he says that, someone else says above him, "Yes, what about dear Abigail?" And as Dawn turns around and everybody looks up at who was talking, we see Sunderland is floating in the air, and he's saying, "Hello, Holland. It's been a long time. Did you miss me?" And Swamp Thing looks up at him and says, "Sunderland?" And then he looks a little harder and he says, "You're not the general." And then Sunderland's face begins to morph where half of it's Sunderland and half of it's Anton again. And he says, "So you recognize me already, eh? I must give you credit, Holland. You're far more astute than my slut of a niece." And this really angers Swamp Thing, and he says, "If you've done anything to harm her." But Sunderland cuts him off saying, "You have nothing to fear, for now. If you wish to see your wife again, Holland, bring the child, Tefe, to the Sunderland Corporation headquarters in Washington, D.C. I should also say that this is definitely an apparition of him. It's not his physical body, because we just saw him in Washington, D.C. a couple seconds ago, and that would be really hard for him to travel down here that fast. So while they've been talking, Lady Jane has taken Tefe, and Tefe just looks annoyed. And I was thinking maybe she would be scared or like traumatized by seeing Anton again or hearing his voice because of when she was possessed by him in issue 125. So Swamp Thing looks at the Sunderland apparition and says, "What do you want of my daughter, Arcane?" And Sunderland replies, "You're in no position to question me, Holland. Just do as I say, or your precious Abby will find herself a blushing bride for my unmen. Is that understood? And Swamp Thing grits his teeth and says, understood. And then the apparition begins to fade, and as it does, Sunderland says, excellent. Bring the brat to me within the next 48 hours, or Abigail becomes the first of my unwomen. Be seeing you, Holland. And then his apparition disappears completely, and Lady Jane walks up to Swamp Thing and says, Prime Founder, you mustn't do this. And Swamp Thing says, I can't let that maniac hurt Abby. And Dawn asks Swamp Thing, wait a minute, who the hell was that guy? And Swamp Thing turns to him and says, that guy is Abby's late uncle, Anton Arcane. And Dawn asks, you mean he's dead? And Swamp Thing answers, technically, yes. And then Dawn grabs his head and begins to rub it like he's saying, what have I gotten myself into? And then John comes up to him and pats him on the shoulder and says, fall in love with a stranger and see where it gets you, eh, mate? And Dawn just says to him, my head hurts. And as we turn the page, we see Swamp Thing is trying to think, and he says out loud, we must figure out a means of transporting Tefe to Washington. I can travel through the green in the blink of an eye. However, Tefe's ability to move through the life web is far less certain. And then Dawn says to Swamp Thing, I have a private Learjet in New Orleans. I can have her prepped and ready to fly within the hour. And Swamp Thing replies, that will do. And what about you, Constantine? Are you here to help? Or are you just along for the ride? And then John lights a cigarette, and he doesn't say anything. He just takes a long drag, and Swamp Thing says, Constantine. And John kind of gives a smile and says, hold a tick, will ya? There's something about this Sunderland business that's been nagging me from the start. And then John has a recollection, and he says, that's it. Bloody hell. I knew there was something. About 6 months ago, I got this letter from the Sunderland Corporation. They were making inquiries concerning this low-rent occult scientist, metaphysical engineer, who calls himself Dr. Polygon. Then we get a bunch of flashback scenes where we see a younger version of John walking into some kind of auditorium where Dr. Polygon is showing off one of his magic inventions, where we see like a girl sitting on a stage next to him, and she has this weird helmet contraption on her head. And John's narration continues. I first ran across Polygon a few years back when he was making his initial big push with his spiritual ergonomics racket. It was mostly a load of pseudo-scientific rubbish, promising to give yuppie execs the edge by using special psychic tricks on their office mates. Polygon's shtick was combining scientific Tommy rot with the usual half-baked mystic mumbo-jumbo. He had himself this contraption called the spiritual ergometer, which when used in connection with certain meditation techniques he'd ripped off from various ancient source materials, supposedly boosted the wearer's psychic abilities. The trouble is, the sod is more into results than research. He didn't realize that some people are stronger focal points for repressed psychic power than others. Tapping into such preternatural energy isn't a game. You can't master it in an hour, no matter how much you paid for the damn seminar. But that's the story of Polygon's career in sorcery. Smug arrogance combined with equal parts ignorance, greed, and slipshod research. It makes for a dangerous combination in magic. And we see in the flashback the lady that's wearing the helmet on stage. All of a sudden, I don't know if she's bursting into flames or just a lot of energy is moving through her psychically, but she's screaming out in pain, and Polygon is putting his hands to shield his face, and the audience is looking in horror. And John continues. A few years later, Polygon had the balls to apply for a membership in the Magi Guild. I happened to be sitting in that time out. It was a real pleasure slipping that wanker the old black ball. And we see in this part of the flashback, Polygon is in front of a magic council, including John Constantine, and then we see John giving him a thumbs down and smiling at him, and Polygon looking kind of angry. Then we cut from the flashback back to John talking in the swamp, and he says to the Swamp Thing, the last I heard of Polygon, he was trying to retrofit his spiritual ergonomics for the aging baby boomer market, longevity enhancement, healthcare through creative visualization, cancer cures, resurrecting the dead, the usual stuff. And as Swamp Thing thinks about what John is saying to him, he says, that would explain Arcane using Sunderland as a host body. And then John and Swamp Thing walk together, and John says, "That sounds like Polygon right enough. The idiot tries to bring back the dead and ends up with a minor demon infestation in a reanimated corpse. What a complete and utter Burke." Then we cut back to the Sunderland Corporation in the lab where Abby is tied up, and Polygon is in the room with her, and he's saying, "You're so pretty. So very, very pretty. Maybe the general will make you my bride when this is all over. Wouldn't you like that, And at the thought of that, Abby just looks down and kind of like she's wincing, and Polygon gets very angry at this, and he grabs her by the face and he says, "Look at me! Look at me when I talk to you! Am I that hideous?" And then we get a little interesting personality trait, or I guess character trait of Polygon. Because Polygon has multiple heads grafted onto his main face, all of them begin to say, "Hideous, hideous, hideous. No one will ever look at me again. Nothing but a freak, 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 freak." And then Polygon begins to smack the other heads that are attached to his head, and he's saying to them, "Shut up, shut up." But they continue yelling, "I thought I knew what I was doing. Everything under control. Wrong, wrong, wrong." And Polygon yells out to them again, "Shut up, you damn fool. Shut up." And then he falls to the ground in tears and he says, "I don't have to listen to you, any of you." Then we cut from the lab into Sunderland and Connie talking. And I think they're in a different part of the lab because Sunderland is standing in front of a bunch of beakers. And Connie is saying to him, "Honestly, Daddy, I don't see why you have to keep that slut here. Couldn't we stick her in cold storage instead?" And Sunderland answers, "Constance, my pet, I've already explained that the Holland woman is necessary for my plans." And Constance tries to push back against this, saying, But Sunderland cuts her off and says, "There is no but. The Holland woman stays here with me. That is all I have to say on the subject, and that is final. Now, leave me alone. I'm sick of your incessant yammering." So Connie turns angrily and says, "Yes, Daddy." Then she walks into the room where Abby is being kept, and she's looking down at her like she's very angry at Abby. And she picks up a scalpel and walks over to Abby and grabs Abby by the hair and pulls her head back. And Abby has a gag on her mouth, so she can't talk, but she definitely protests as this is happening. And as Connie pulls Abby's head back, she shows her the scalpel and says, "I'm not going to let you get away with what you're doing. I didn't bring him back just so some bimbo like you could take him away from me." And then behind her, we hear Sunderland say, "Connie!" And as Sunderland approaches her, she says very scared, "Daddy, But Sunderland smacks her across the face before she can finish, and he says, "How dare you disobey me? Get out of here, and stay out until I tell you to come back." And as Connie leaves the room, Sunderland turns to Abby and says, "She didn't hurt you, did she, my dear? After all, I don't want to spoil my fun." Then we cut to Connie, who's sitting in her office, and she's crying at her desk as she thinks back on her father throughout the years. And her narration says, "He struck her. She really couldn't be surprised. After all, he used to do it back when he was alive. He didn't want her around then, and he doesn't want her around now. She'd hoped bringing him back would change how he felt about her, but she was wrong. He is the general, and the general never changes." And we see a little flashback moment where General Sunderland is smacking her as a small child. So it seems that she was definitely abused by him while she was growing up. Then we cut to the outside of the Sunderland Corporation building, where we see a taxi pull up, and as it does, we see inside the window John Constantine, Dawn, and Tefe. And John is looking up at the building and he says, "This looks like the right place, all right. Be a good bloke and pay the man, won't you, Reynard?" Then we cut back to Connie's office where she's getting a buzz on her phone, and she pushes the speaker button and says, "Yes, Smithers, what is it?" And Smithers answers, "Miss Sunderland, there is a Mr. Constantine, Mr. Reynard, and a little girl here to see you." And Connie replies, "Do they have appointments?" And Smithers answers, "No." And Connie rubs her forehead like she's thinking she works with idiots, and then she says, "Well, then tell them to get lost, Smithers." But just as she says that, the doors to her office open up, and we see John Constantine walk in with Dawn and Tefe, and John says to her, "Hate to break in on you like this, but I think we're expected." And she says to John, "How dare you? Smithers, call security." But before that happens, a door opens up to what looks like possibly a secret hidden room, and Sunderland comes out and he says, "There's no need for that, Constance. These people are indeed here at my request. And we see standing next to him is the cloaked figure of Polygon. And as Sunderland turns to give John a once-over, he says, "Interesting. I did not think he would use you as his emissary." And John says, "So you know me then?" And Sunderland answers, "Your name is known where I am from, Englishman." Then Connie walks over to Sunderland and says, "Father, you know these people?" And Sunderland answers her, "In my own way. In any case, they are here at my bidding. But enough of this charade. Where is he? He would no more send his child here unprotected than he would leave his wife to my tender mercies." And then Sunderland shouts to the room, "Holland, show yourself!" And then we see Swamp Thing's face and body begin to appear in the oak wooden door for this room. And Swamp Thing says, "I am here, Arcane." And then Sunderland gives a big smile and says, "Now we can start the game." And then he quickly barks, "Polygon, seize the child!" And then Polygon moves to try to take Tefe, and John punches him in the face and says, "Hands off, asshole." But as he does this, the cloak of Polygon falls back, because as of right now, Polygon's kind of been hiding behind Sunderland while he was talking, and so no one could see Polygon in his horrific face. But as John punches him, the cloak falls off, and John sees the horror that is now Polygon, and he exclaims, "Bloody hell! Jesus, Polygon! I always knew you were two-faced, but you made a royal bollocksing of it this time, didn't you?" And at this, Polygon yells out, "Constantine, you bastard!" But before he can do anything, Swamp Thing actually walks in between John and Polygon and says, "Tefe remains with me until I see Abby." And Sunderland says to Swamp Thing, "Very well. Have it your way, Holland. For now. Follow me." And then they all kind of single file walk through the lab. And it's kind of funny because this is just like a big pause before the storm as Sunderland walks and monologues about what happened after Swamp Thing killed General Sunderland in the Alan Moore run. And I guess all this info was not known to Anton, who was killed and went to hell just before the Alan Moore run started. So as they walk, Sunderland's saying to Swamp Thing, "I used the computer to access your autopsy, Holland. The one Dr. Woodrue performed on you several years ago. I found it quite intriguing. Tell me, how does it feel, returning to the cradle of your rebirth?" And in case you don't know, in the beginning of the Alan Moore run, Swamp Thing was thought to be killed by General Sunderland. Sunderland had Swamp Thing in cryogenic storage, but Dr. Woodrue discovered that Swamp Thing was not a man trapped in a plant's body, but rather a plant that thought it was a man. And in discovering this, Woodrue actually wanted to see what would happen if he turned off the cryo chamber. Would Swamp Thing come back to life? And he did, and Swamp Thing killed General Sunderland that night. So as Sunderland brings up these memories, Swamp Thing looks around at the place and he says, "It is just another place, nothing more." So finally they make it into the main laboratory area where Abby is supposed to be. And as they enter, Swamp Thing asks, "Where is Abby? You said she was here." And then Sunderland says, "And so she is. Bring her out." And then he claps his hands as if to beckon someone. And then we see two new unmen bring Abby out, but she is in a wedding dress, and her face is covered by a veil. And the unmen just kind of look like generic humanoid monsters. And as Swamp Thing sees Abby, he says, "Abby?" But the unmen don't let her go. They actually pull her closer to them, and then one of them holds a knife up to her throat. But we still can't see beneath the veil. And Sunderland walks in between them and says, "Stay where you are, Holland. One step closer and she dies. Is that understood?" And Swamp Thing grits his teeth and says, "All too well. What is it you want?" And then Sunderland points to Tefe and says, "It's quite simple, really. I'm not asking for much. Just for your loathsome little brat to build me a new body." And Swamp Thing exclaims, "That's ridiculous." But Sunderland cuts him off saying, "Don't give me that, Holland. I know all too well what your precious little bastard can do. Or have you forgotten?" And then Swamp Thing has a flash of a memory from back in issue 125 when Anton possessed little Tefe's body and was making all these different constructs of dead people from around the swamp. And Swamp Thing says, "No, I remember." And then Sunderland begins to walk over to a big square object that's covered with a sheet, and he says, "I realize the child can't simply conjure flesh and blood out of thin air. She needs raw material to work with. Sunderland Industries has its fingers in all kinds of pies, Everything from biomechanical weapons to artificial flavoring for junk food to cloning research. And as he says cloning research, he pulls the cloth off the square object and we see there is a baby fetus that is growing inside of an artificial womb. So Sunderland opens the vat, reaches inside and grabs the fetus out and places it on a table in front of him and Tefe. And he says to Swamp Thing, "Either your daughter accelerates the growth of this clone right now, or her mother dies in front of her very eyes. It's as simple as that. Well, Holland, what's it going to be?" And then Swamp Thing kneels down to Tefe, who's standing on her own, sucking her thumb, and he whispers something into her ear, and we can't hear what that is. But as we turn the page, we see Tefe concentrating very hard, and then the fetus begins to grow on the table in front of everybody. And then it grows from baby size to teenage size to human size to slightly bigger than human. This is like what you would think the perfect specimen of a human male would be. This body is super muscular, and compared to Sunderland's current body, it's massive. And as Sunderland watches the finishing of his new body grow, he says, "At last! Finally! I have a host body worth of my essence! Now I can shed this wretched, withered carcass!" And with that, Sunderland raises his arms, and the spirit of Anton Arcane leaves Sunderland's body. And as it does, it shouts, "I'm free! Free to be young and strong once more again!" And as his spirit moves into the newly grown body, the corpse of Sunderland falls to the ground, face planting, and Connie sees this and yells out, "Daddy!" And she rushes over to the body and she says, "Daddy, no! You can't leave me again! Not after all I've done to bring you back! Please, don't go!" And as she begins to cry, all of a sudden, the new body of Anton Arcane stands up and says, "How touching! If only my own flesh and blood was as loyal." And then Connie looks up with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She's really hoping that her dad is now in this new body, and she says, "Daddy?" But Anton answers, "No, I'm not your father, Connie. To tell you the truth, he was never here at all. In fact, your precious daddy is still merrily roasting away in hell. The last time I saw him, Lord Necros was using him as a toilet brush." And then Connie brings her hands up to her ears to cover them, and she says, "I refuse to listen to such lies. I'm not hearing this." And as she wallows on the ground, Swamp Thing walks over and says to Anton, "Arcane, you promised to return Abby if Tefe did as you said. She's lived up to her part of the bargain." And now that Swamp Thing is standing in front of Arcane's new body, we see that they are the same size. So now he is definitely more of a match for Swamp Thing, at least in strength. So Anton looks down at his new body and he begins to flex his arms and he says, "And so she has. Quite admirably too, I must add. It has been decades since I savored such youthful vigor. At last, a body free of age, disease, and deformity. It's like being reborn into the best of all physical worlds." And then Anton points to Abby, who's still currently being held by the Unmen, and he says, "You can have her. She's all yours, Holland. Although I warn you, she hasn't exactly been herself lately." And then Swamp Thing walks towards Abby and says, "Abby, are you all right?" And as Swamp Thing walks up to her to remove her veil, she says, Alec, please, don't look at me." And as we turn to the last page, we get a full page splash of Abby's new face revealed. And not just her face, half of her body also has changed. But basically, she looks like Two-Face. She's split down the middle. One side looks like normal Abby, and the other side has gray skin like it's from a dead person or something. The lips are spread open so you can see her gums and teeth really far back into her mouth. And she raises her hand to block her face, and it just happens to be her left hand, which is the bad hand. And we see now she has gray skin on that as well, and she only has 4 fingers, like the pinky and ring finger have been fused together. And she yells out, "Don't look at me!" And then she turns from Swamp Thing, and then Anton begins to laugh maniacally in the background. And with that evil laugh, that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.